Good morning, everybody. It is 9 o'clock. Welcome to the session this morning. There are still people joining the meeting, or at least the webinar. Can I just, as a show of hands before we begin, could you confirm, one, that you can hear me, and two, that you can see the presentation? Cool. Thank you so much. All righty. Okay. So before we begin, we have, for those of you in Durban, have had a fair amount of rain, which is still coming down. And so if we do, for whatever reason, have a connectivity issue during the session, if it becomes unbearable, we may need to change the session for another day. We are going to continue. But if at any point a number of you start to have issues to hear me as an example, then, if you could just pop it in the chat, and we may have to, make alternative arrangements or reschedule the session. For those of you who have joined, if you're unable to see the slides, sometimes it's better to exit the meeting and rejoin. If majority of the people can see the slides, then it may be an issue on your side in terms of a connectivity issue. So if you could just pop in the chat if you are having an issue or if you can't hear me. I have with me today Clarice, who will be monitoring the Q&A section as well as the chat section. So if anybody has any questions or anything as we go through, please feel free to pop it in the chat, and then we will answer them as we go. Okay, for those of you who don't know me, and I do recognize some of the names, I do know some of you, and so welcome to those of you that I do know. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Nikki Hardwick. I am a consultant at HR Talk. I have been with the company for over 20 years. And so, in my experience working within different industries, obviously seeing the implementation of BEE as well as employment equity, development, I've worked in various industries in terms of trying to get the three to work together. So I am making the assumption that everybody that is attending today basically is has worked with possibly all three, so skills, BEE, and employment equity, or is considering looking into BEE. Just from a point of view is explaining as we go through. So what is quite important is to understand, and again, I'm assuming that most of you have been involved to some extent, but I'm going to just very broadly explain the three different aspects and then go into more detail, not necessarily in terms of how each of these work. So there are different webinars that will talk into, the specific compliance issues with regards to employment equity. I'm not a BEE specialist, so I'm not going to be going into the intricate details of BEE, but I am going to be talking broadly and then obviously from a skills development perspective. So it's not going to be about how do you go about claiming. It is going to be more about, how we kind of link the three together. So if we just have a look at the three aspects together, and I'll go into it just now, but we're talking about three different pieces of possibly legislation, and then also in terms of what does it mean for you as a business. So if we look broadly at, employment equity, so there has been changes in the legislation which talk about the sector targets, but if we look at who is required to comply, the first element is, and probably the main one now, is that if you have more than 50 employees, you are required to be to submit and comply with the employment equity legislation. So a piece of legislation, much like the basic conditions, labor relations, etc., is a piece of legislation that says if you meet certain criteria, you are required to comply. So from an employment equity perspective, it is not something that you choose to do. It is not something that if you feel like doing it, you would do. If you are over 50, there is 50 employees, you are required to comply with employment equity. So that's the first thing. Then we have the Skills Development Act. Now, there's various pieces of legislation with regards to skills development. There's one in terms of who is required to pay and how they're required to pay and where does the money go. And then you've got the Skills Development Act, which talks about what are we as employers required to do. Now, there's various different aspects of that, but skills development is also a piece of legislation. And what's probably most important in this context is the who is required to pay what is called the skills development levy. So in terms of that, there is a legal requirement. So again, not if you choose to, or we're still on the first slide. I'm just talking broadly. So from a skills development perspective, if you have a payroll of more than 500,000, per annum, there is a requirement that you pay a levy. Okay. It is not a choice. So again, skills, not a choice if you have more than 500,000. There is a choice whether or not you wish to claim that back, whether you wish to take advantage of things like learnerships and bursaries. You are not legally required to do that. However, you are legally required to pay employment equity. If you have more than 50 employees, you are legally required to comply, and that does include, I saw a question, both temporary as well as permanent employees. Okay, so those two pieces of legislation, legal requirements to comply. Then we have BEE, and for the most part in private entities, BEE is actually a business decision. It may be a business decision, where you are almost forced into complying, or at least, applying for a BEE certificate because your clients require it. However, not everybody has to do BEE. We do it because it makes business sense for us to do it. And so that is why we choose to do BEE, because we either want to go for government contracts, our clients are requiring that we have a certificate that says we're a level 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever it may be, but we choose to do it from a business perspective. Okay, so I'm going to be moving on to the next slide. If at any point I move on and you don't see the slides again, just give it a bit of time. I think that the connectivity, because of the rain, especially in Durban, it's not great. But as I move on, I will let you know. Okay. So broadly, what we're going to be talking about is how we link the three together. So what are the important, strategic sort of objectives when we're looking at how do we make skills work from a BEE perspective and an employment equity perspective. Remembering, as I've said before, there is a legal requirement for you to pay skills development levy. So that is 1% of your salary bill. If you have more than 500,000 annual payroll, there is no legal requirement for you to claim any of that back or to take part in things like learnerships and whatever. So there's a lot of companies who do skills development, but only as a sort of basic kind of, they do the basic sort of things and they don't take full advantage, which when you look at the three together, it can actually work really beneficially for you as an organization to take advantage of the skills development and how you can claim back and make that work from a BEE perspective as well as employment equity. We're going to be looking at the challenges in terms of skills development and compliance, the strategic approaches to skills development. Guys, I'm going to be talking at quite a high level. If you want more in-depth sort of solutions and how you can possibly do that, then we can always have a meeting afterwards. But I'm going to be trying to talk high level so that you can understand, from a high level perspective, how you can link the three together and some of the things that you can do to take advantage to make it work from both. How do we link employment equity to skills development? Remembering that the legislation has now changed and now we're working to set the targets, which are what we need to achieve in 5 years. So what do we do from a skills development perspective to empower us to try and meet our targets from an employment equity perspective? And then obviously, how does all of these sort of tie into you as an employer, looking at employer of choice, trying to find ways to retain people that don't necessarily tie into specifically, a monetary value. So how can we use these things to try and create a space in which we retain our staff? Okay. Alrighty. Okay. So the first things first, said before, we've got broad-based Black economic empowerment, or BEE, okay, which is in terms of business, there are, this is something that we put in place because from a business perspective, it makes sense. It is not a legislated thing in which if you have more than 50 employees, you're required to do, unless, of course, again, if you're working with government, for argument's sake, government may say you are required to have a BEE certificate. But if you choose not to work with government, you still have the ability to say yes or to say no. So BEE is a business decision. Okay, so in terms of BEE, and I can't go into specific detail in terms of the sector codes and what each of the elements, or the points, etc. So I think that there are, could be wrong, but I think there's 18 different sectors which tie into quite closely so there's 12. Okay, so sorry, there's 12 sector codes. Okay. And depending on which sector you are in will depend on what percentage of payroll you need to spend on certain things, what your management control. So each of the different sectors that you that you fall within, and you would then, based on what you're doing, you would fall within a particular sector. There's obviously, and then there's also elements in which you could be an EME, which is an exempted micro enterprise. Then you move into a QSC, which is based on turnover. And again, in terms of your different sector codes, turnover may change depending on what sector code you're in. So it could be, if you're between, for argument's sake, between 10 million and 50 million, you're a QSC. And as a QSC, you're required to do different things. So the general sort of pillars, if we want to call it that, so it is pillars within BEE. So we look at ownership, which is one of the pillars. Now, ownership will have a certain number of points. Then there's management control, skills development, which is what we're going to be talking about today. There's enterprise and supplier development, and then there's socioeconomic development. Okay. So the main thing that we're going to be exploring today is pillar number 3. Now, again, very often when I go into, clients, what happens with skills development, because it is quite an onerous thing, trying to capture the training, trying to make sure that all the documents that are in place in order to claim are all there, people don't end up giving it the attention that it deserves. So 9 times out of 10, what happens is a person, you'll go into a client, they will have done pretty much nothing for the entire year. And then we get to the WSP ATR time, which is coming now at the end of April. And so what people do is they'll quickly say, okay, what training have we done in the last 12 months? And let's have a look and see what we're going to do. So there's very minimal training. And so what happens is you don't take advantage of the number of points that you could possibly get from a BEE perspective. Remembering we're tying the two in here. Okay. When we then have a look at, skills development, one of the key aspects of BEE is the intention to try and upskill specifically Black employees. Okay. So when we look at employment equity, just remember that there is a difference. So Black, in terms of employment equity, is obviously African, colored, and Indian. But in terms of employment equity, we have Black employees, but we also have designated employees. So for equity, we've got African, colored, Indian, obviously South African people, but a designated employee for equity also includes white women, and it also includes people with disabilities, which is everybody, including white women. From a skills perspective, in terms of the ability to claim back for training, there is no so they don't exclude anybody. So if you do training for your staff, and obviously if it meets the requirement, remembering training could be both internal training as well as external training. We'll go through the various different types. Anything that you do in terms of skills, you can claim back for everybody. So from a skills perspective, it does not exclude anybody. Then when we look at from a BEE perspective, and I'll go through the different elements just now, from a BEE perspective, The only training that is being looked at is that for Black employees, which is, as I said before, African, coloured, and Indian. Okay, both male and female, but depending on your sector codes, you will be able to, from a RAND perspective, claim back more depending on if it's a female and depending on if the female is disabled. So you can, for argument's sake, claim back a certain amount for Black employees in that one particular section, and I'll go forward now, and then you can claim it again if the person that was trained was a Black female, okay, remembering Black is African Indian coloured, and then if that person is disabled, which has a different definition from an equity perspective to a BEE perspective. So you can have someone from a BEE perspective who is disabled, but when you look at it from an equity perspective, they are not disabled. So for example, if you've got someone who is asthmatic, from a BEE perspective, if they have a letter from the doctor, they may be designated as a disabled person for BEE, but when you look at it from an equity perspective, because it does not influence their promotion or advancements in employment, they would not be disabled from that perspective. Okay, so just talking very broadly here, so this is just an example. Please don't take the required spend, etc. I hope everyone can see it. If you can't, just I think it's press control and increase your mouse, and it will make the screen bigger for you. But if we look at the skills spend, so when we look at the scorecard, every single, sorry, and I'm going to go back a second. So for each of these elements over here will carry a certain number of points, okay? Ownership, as an example, might carry 3 points. Management control could carry, 5 points. So depending on your sector, whichever sector you're in, it will define how many points you can get in that particular section. And, what does it mean to get that particular point? So when we look at skills development, for example, in here, you can see that we have the ability, because learnerships are included. If learnerships were not included, you would take those points out over there. So in this example, we have the ability to get 31 points. Okay. Now, remembering that with BEE, when you're looking at the points section, you can get more than 100 points. So anything over, I think it's between 90 and over 100, is you can get to a level 1, or it's over 100 and above, you can get to level 1. So you have the ability, depending on how you're going to spend your money, is you have the ability to get to more than 100. So when we look at skills development, if we look at it from this perspective over here, let's assume, remembering when we look at BE, we're assuming what is going to happen at the end of the next financial year. So we make an assumption, and my suggestion is that every single employer that is doing BE, you need to have a spreadsheet in which you are monitoring specifically, do it this way, what is your spend on training? Obviously, I would recommend that you also look at the other things, but what is your spend that you're having on training? So we estimate here, for argument's sake, that our annual payroll at the end of the next financial year, so our end of our next audit period, is going to be 25 million. So in this particular sector code, we now know that the percentage spend required for BEE purposes, so in order to get some of the points, to get the maximum points, so for all Black employees, okay, remembering that for skills, we're claiming everything back, including white males, white females, we're claiming everything back. But from a BE perspective, we have to spend 750,000 Rand, okay, which obviously, depending on your estimated payroll, that amount will change, and depending on the percentage spend that you have to look at. But 750,000 Rand is a lot of money to spend on skills development. So what most businesses do is they don't focus on a skills development, because trying to find 750,000 Rand, as an example, to spend on training is a lot of money. And so what they do is they don't focus on this, but they forget that they now have possibly, if we look at learnerships, 31 points that we can use towards our BEE points. But because it's too difficult, so they can't see their way out, they just ignore this completely. So when we look at the various different things, which I'll get into now, is there's a number of different ways in which you can utilize your skills development, so the levy that you're paying every month, which is your 1%, if you are doing things correctly, you have the ability to take advantage of, the SETA funding, discretionary grants to try and up and spend not necessarily your money, but SETA's money to increase the 750. So just remember over here, when we look at any training, okay, so any training that is done, which is inclusive of internal training. So if I spend an hour training 15 of my staff, the percentage, and depending on which sector you're in, a percentage of my salary, so per hour, is now allocated to the spend for those 10 staff. Obviously, a portion, so what you would do is you would say there's 10 staff divided by, let's say, 500 Rand. So that would be X amount per person. We exclude the element for the white staff. And so from a BEE perspective, we would then incorporate the training done for the black staff. If any of those, so I'm going to get my spend over here for those particular people. If any of those are black female, I need to spend 1%. So of this 25 million, I need to spend 1%, which is 250,000. Remembering that it's counted over here. So for every one training I do, I count an element over here. I also count it over here. And if they disable black people, I then count it over here. So each of these things, I have the ability to count it not only once, but it could be 3 times. Okay. Then you have the ability is to add, for argument's sake, is learnerships. Now, learnerships is not based on one in my particular sector. It wouldn't be based, for argument's sake, on payroll. It would be based on headcount. So you could say on your headcount, we need to have 2 learnerships, and you have the ability. Again, I don't know if these points are correct. It's just an example. You over here have the ability, instead of just getting these points, if you implement a learnership, you can get an additional 6 points. So now you have the ability to get 31 points. And I'll get into yes just now. You have 31 points that you can now start to claim for within your skills development, 31 points towards your BEE scorecard that you wouldn't have necessarily had before. Also remember that if you have official sort of internships, which is something in which a person will get a qualification as a result of working in your environment or in your organization, you can claim a portion of their salary towards the skills development. So if you have someone, not every industry will have internships, but if you have internships, you can claim a portion of their salary towards your annual spend. So if you've got someone who comes in, and let's, for argument's sake, say, you're spending 5,000 Rand every month towards their salary so that they can complete a 12-month internship with you. And as a result, at the end of it, they get a qualification due to the experience or whatever. We're now looking at 60,000 Rand towards your 750,000 Rand. Okay. There's other things as well that you can take advantage of, which I will go through now. But in terms of looking at the different types of things, when we go and we start exploring with our SETA, which I'm going to go through now, is you can start to unpack various different options that you can use to get the most points over here. Obviously, there's other elements. So you've got to look at your social development. You've got to look at enterprise. But this is possibly one of the largest portions in which you can take advantage of your skills development, provided you're paying your 1%. And provided you are submitting the reports on time, so you have to submit your reports by the 30th of April, and you've got to submit it to your SETA, you have the ability to take advantage of a number of different things. Okay, so I may come back to this slide just now. Okay, so let me just get to that question. Hold on. So the question is, Black is inclusive of other designated groups? Yes. So Black, in terms of the definition, is African, Indian, and colored. Obviously, we're talking about South African people. Okay, so we're not talking about somebody who's a foreign national. We don't take that into consideration. It would be somebody who is African, Indian, or colored. If we're looking at equity, we take into account a designated group, which is Black plus white women and people with disabilities. So over here, it is very specific. When we're looking at disabled people, it's not the same definition as equity. Here we're specifically looking at Black. Okay. So if we then have a look at our skills development and the kinds of things that we can start to do, All right. So for mandatory claiming, so we have the ability to claim back 20% of our spend. So if you've got an annual salary bill, and my maths is horrendous, but if you've got an annual salary bill of 25 million, you have to spend with the SETA, and you're paying it every month, you've got to spend 1% of that. So every month you are paying the SETA anyway, okay? So you're paying them. The best option is to try and claim that back. So in terms of your 1%, and I've done other webinars on this as well, so you can go and have a look at the webinar in terms of how you claim that back. But in terms of claiming that back, so of your 1% that you pay into SETA, if you submit your skills development reporting annually by the 30th of April, and provided it meets the objectives and it meets the criteria submitted by the SETA, so in other words, it's approved, you have the ability, just for submitting and meeting their requirements, to claim back 20% of your 1%. So if you now start to do the maths, in terms of your 750,000 Rand that you need to spend, if you do your workplace skills plan and you do your annual training report, you have the ability to claim back 20% to spend on more training. Remembering that when we're looking at skills, we are not just talking about external things. We're talking about internal things. We're talking about internal training. So that could be anything. If we're looking at, I know in certain industries, they will have things like toolbox talks. Now, provided that the toolbox talk is not necessarily talking about, when you should or shouldn't be going to, the loo, or, where you should eat your lunch, etc. If they're talking about actual training, you could use the toolbox talks as part of your training if you are detailing what it is that you are teaching. If you have an ability to teach people, for argument's sake, in your organization, how to use Excel, if you've got, depending on what it is, you can use a number of things within your organization, and provided you've got attendance registers and everything is monitored on a monthly basis, you have your ability to claim back 20% of your 1%, which you can then spend on possibly doing other training. Remembering that in terms of your 750, so this is, you can push up your spend over here by looking at things like internships as well as learnerships, and you can start to claim back money through your skills with your 1% to actually spend it on something else. Okay. Then in terms of, and we'll talk a little bit about employment equity just now, but by looking at your skills development, and trying to look at it more strategically, so i.e. at the beginning of every year, before we go into the new skills year, is having a look and going, all right, how much money do I think that I need to be spending on my skills development for BEE? So if I've got my, projected salary bill of 25 million, I have to spend 750,000 Rand. What am I spending every single month in terms of my skills development levy? How much can I claim back part of that? In addition to your 20%, there is something called discretionary funding, which if you submit your annual training report by the 30th and it's approved, and you have projected that you are going to do what is called pivotal training, and that's anything that results in a qualification or at least points towards a qualification, you have the ability to take part in what is called discretionary funding. And really what that is that you approach your SETA when their window opens, and you have the ability to apply for funding for things like learnerships, bursaries. So depending on your SETA, and this is why it's quite important to be part of the correct SETA, is if you are in manufacturing and you've been incorrectly allocated to your bank SETA, it's important that you change, because what your SETA will do is your SETA will identify particular skills development opportunities to increase the skills within your SETA. As you can imagine, what they look for within the banking sector or the financial sector is not necessarily going to align to you if you are in manufacturing. So you need to make sure that you're in the correct SETA, and then what you do is you start to unpack, what do we need from a BEE perspective, and what are we going to apply for, not just internal training, but what can we apply for within our workplace skills plan to say, if we had all the money in the world, what would we try and do? The SETA then will look at that and decide, for example, if you say you want, I don't know, the following training, that could be both pivotal as well as non-pivotal. So remember, pivotal is anything that works towards credits towards a qualification. So it has an NQF level, and it will give you some sort of, points, which could lead to a qualification at some point. Alternatively, it could be external training, but that is not accredited. And then obviously you have your internal training, which you can then add in there. If you put something in your workplace skills plan on either side and the SETA approves that, they may end up giving you additional funding to go and fund that particular bursary. It could be a learnership, it could be a qualification. And so they may select you as an organization that if you still wish to do it, you can select someone to be able to train. Now, going back to our skills development, if you can apportion some of that 750,000 Rand by money given to you by the SETA, you are then able to reach your 750,000 Rand with money that isn't necessarily yours. Okay, so looking at how you can best plan your money, and obviously if we look at the SETAs, one of the things I would recommend, and they don't all have them, some of them are outdated, is having a look at the sector skills plan within your particular SETA to identify what are they doing to, or at least what have they identified as a shortage of skills within your particular industry. If you look at where their objectives lie and you try and align it to your objectives, so if you see that there's a shortage of skills in, I don't know, let's say accountants, and that's where you are, and one of their objectives is to increase qualifications with accountants. If you have someone identified within your business, and now we come to employment equity, identified within your business that you would like to upskill, assuming the funding comes through, you can then put that person through as somebody that you would like to upskill from a, let's say accounting perspective. If you put that in your skills development plan, you have a better opportunity to get the money back. Remembering, so a lot of people forget about this, there's two types of grants that you can apply for. The one is the mandatory grant, which is our 30th of April. That is the one where you log into the portal and you put all your employees in and you say, what training did we do in our ATR and what training are we going to do? Okay, so that's the one aspect. There is another aspect which a lot of people don't do, which is the application for discretionary grants. Now, that is a different application altogether. Sometimes some SETAs will do the applications on the same day at the same time, whereas others will have random periods through the year where they will open up a window for discretionary funding. There is a separate section for most SETAs, I can't be clear on both, where you will have another section where you will log in to apply for discretionary funding for particular employees. Now, discretionary funding may relate to, for argument's sake, employed learners, and it may relate to unemployed learners. So you could, for argument's sake, apply for discretionary funding for a learnership for unemployed learners. Those people could go off somewhere, and again, that will come into your skills, is where you are funding, and you may put a stipend on the top of it. You are funding somebody who's unemployed to continue and to do a learnership. At the end of it, they may or may not come and work for you, but that can go towards your spend. You may also end up doing, I keep talking about learnerships, but there's bursaries, there's, artisan training. So depending on your industry, there's a number of things which you can make application for. Within those discretionary funds, there's certain criteria. So as an example, it may only be, in terms of a funding window, it may be specifically related to Gauteng as an example. So if you don't meet those requirements, well, then obviously you don't have that. How do you access the discretionary grants? They are supposed to, or at least they say that they do send emails. A number of SETAs don't send emails. You actually have to go onto their website or make contact with them to find out if there is a window that is opened. We recommend, if you're going to be looking at this, that you phone at the very least once a month. Remembering that if you apply for discretionary funding, generally there's a window, and that window is a month, during which time you have to find certain documentation, you need to do certain things, you need to sign MOAs and a number of different things. So you have a month in which you select people that you would like to go on this thing. Now, when we tie that into, and I'm still on the same slide, okay, is when we tie that into employment equity, one of the things with employment equity is we obviously have to upskill people. So where we have to upskill people is not necessarily to meet the requirements from an equity perspective, because equity and skills development is very, very small. But there is a requirement for us to diversify and transform. Now, one of the big issues, in terms of transformation, is finding skilled people within. So if we're going to look external, is very often finding skilled people that will fit into the business is quite difficult. So you may, the cost of recruitment is incredibly high. At the end of it, you may find someone who doesn't fit your culture, doesn't fit into the type of business that you have, doesn't have the skills that you're specifically looking for. And so often, in terms of, if we look at our 5-year plan for employment equity, is if we take people from within the business, one of the things that we can do is identify people that we would like to train using the funding that we can get from our SETAs to be able to upskill them and create almost a plan, a succession planning, so that we can spend the next 5 years identifying people at the lower levels to obviously upskill them using the funding that we're getting from the SETA, and using that then to fund the most points that we can possibly get for our BEE. Okay, just in terms of talking about the different types of funding. So remembering there's a number of different benefits in terms of looking at, when you're applying for funding with the SETA, the very first thing that you can look at is your rebates and your grants. So as I said before, the mandatory grant, which is you can get your 20% back here. Now, a lot of the time, people only focus on the 20%. And that is actually, to a large extent, not a huge amount of money. Okay, it's actually just the thank you for submitting and meeting our requirements. It's not where you can get the best bang for your buck. Okay, so your 20% is a given, hopefully because you've submitted. But where the bigger money comes from is your discretionary grants. Okay. Now, within your discretionary grants, as I've said, and if you go and have a look on YouTube, you will find my previous presentations which talk about the different types of discretionary grants that you can get. I keep referring to learnerships, okay, but that's not the only one. We will have internships, remembering an internship is a specific designated thing. Specifically, when we look at BEE, it is something that results in a qualification, okay. So you cannot just call something an internship and therefore it becomes an internship. It has to have a sort of a, as an accountant, for argument's sake, and forgive me, I could be wrong, but you go and you work and you do articles. I think it's an accountant or a CA. You go and you do your articles, and at the end of it, you become, I don't know, a fully fledged accountant. It could be an artisan. It could be a number of different things that you could look at. There's obviously other things like specific certification, qualifications, and a number of different things. So my suggestion, if you're not taking advantage of the discretionary grants, go online, go and have a look at your SETA, remembering that the portals are different. We've got our mandatory grant portal, and then you've got your discretionary grant portal. The two are different. Okay. If you don't have an internal training department, sorry, one second. If you don't have an internal training department, the idea is that you should get someone who at least at the very least sort of understands the various different things. They don't have to be a specialist in BEE. They don't have to be a specialist in what your business specifically requires in terms of qualifications. That's where your managers kind of get involved. But they do need to understand what it is that we're trying to achieve here, so that we can make best use of our skills, get the most back from it, but then also impacting our BEE. And then how do we link that to our employment equity? Remembering our 5 years in which we need to meet sector targets. Granted that if we train people, it doesn't mean that they're going to stay with us forever. But from an HR perspective, if you're paying for training for someone, you can tie them in for a certain period of time. But what it also does, and I know that I speak about it later, but it also creates a different environment in which you're creating a culture in which people are learning and developing. You're creating a culture in which there are additional benefits other than just financial benefits, in which people can do degrees, because a lot of people can't afford it. They can get qualifications, etc., etc. Okay, if we look at employee tax incentive, okay, so this is not my area of expertise, but there is an ability. Smangela, can you put your question in the chat if you don't mind? Okay, so with the employment tax incentive, so this would be done via your payroll. So if you hire young workers or learners, you can claim ETI. They have to be, so there's certain provisions and that kind of thing, but your payroll provider hopefully will know what this is. The workers need to be between the age of 18 and 29, and your ETI allows you to reduce your PAY liability, and so you're paying less for having these people. So now when you're looking for learners, you're looking for new people. So even if you're employing younger people who are entry level, remember, we're now tying this into equity. So you're employing younger people that you can upskill within your business. You're teaching them what you're doing from a business perspective. Everything that you're teaching them from a business perspective, you record and you keep it there, so that when you're doing your skills training, everything that we're teaching them, we're adding to our skills development. And then in addition to that, you're getting a rebate for your ETI because they're between the ages of 18 and 29. Okay. This again, ETI is not my area of expertise. I do know that it is something that you can claim for. If you would like to have a consultation in regards to that, you just send us an email and we can set that up for you. All right. Then there is also a tax deduction for registered learnership agreements. So certain learnership agreements, if you go into a learnership, you have the ability at the end of the year to get a tax deduction because you went to a particular learnership. So I had a look at one the other day. The learnership, which was a 12-month learnership, let's assume, I think it was about 33,000 Rand. So you would pay 33,000 Rand. That 33,000 Rand, you obviously then put into your pivotal training, you put it into your WSP. So you're possibly paying your 33,000 Rand, which then goes to your spend for your BE. In addition to that, though, what they then said was, if we do this particular learnership, so it's not every learnership, we also have the ability to claim back up to 22,500 Rand in terms of the tax allowance. So you're now having the ability to try and claim back from various different aspects in order to get to your 750,000. Okay. I've already spoken about the scorecard. There is an additional one, which is your National Skills Fund, which is, so in terms of your 1%, a portion of the 1% does go into the National Skills Fund. And in companies that are involved in large-scale training projects, they can apply to the National Skills Fund for funding in this regard. So generally, we don't get involved in that, but there is an ability, but that is large-scale training projects that you can start to have a look at. Okay, so there's a number of different things here that you can start to take advantage of when you are looking at how do you get your money back. It's important though, so just to be clear, with BEE, you need to make sure that you understand where you can claim for certain things and where you can't claim for certain things. So for example, which I haven't spoken about yet, is you have the ability under the YES scheme is to place employees, new employees on the YES scheme. There's various different things that you can do, but under the YES scheme is that the person cannot be on a learnership or an internship. So you would have people that come into your workplace, for work integrated learning. So it's experience, but that person, you cannot claim for them. If they're on an internship, you cannot put them on both the YES scheme as well as the internship, because you will get the points under YES and not under your skills development. So it's important that you understand where you're going to be able to get the most points back. And if you do YES, YES allows you to claim, I think it's an additional 3 points or something along those lines, is if you have the YES scheme, okay, which is really just to try and bump you a couple of levels, but you need to understand what you're doing, because you don't want to forego the spend on your training so that you can get your extra 3 points, because you could be losing, 10 points because you didn't allocate the salaries or whatever it is on the other side. So whoever is doing this within your business, It's not necessarily your BEE consultant. It could be, but their focus is making sure that they are getting the information back. You need someone within your business that is able to look almost on a monthly basis to understand where you need to be spending your money, but then they also need to understand what is the best way of getting money out of your skills development levy. Okay, so just to go in more detail, okay, so as I've said to you just now, and this is obviously just in a sort of point form, so when we look at the strategic approach to skills development, before we even get to internal training and discretionary funding, it is a really good idea is to start to identify the shortfalls within your business. So if you're going to go down this road to try and make the most out of your skills, it is highly recommended that you do some sort of skills audit. It doesn't need to be incredibly high level, but it's to understand where are people falling short, and what are we actually wanting to invest in. And again, if I go to employment equity, so how this ties in there is we have a 5-year long-term plan in which we need to meet, certain sector targets. So what we need to do is to identify what do we want our business to look at? What are the skills that we're looking at internally? Remembering that it doesn't have to be specific qualifications, although those will have more weight. Is it could be a number of soft skills, it could be a number of qualifications, internships, learnerships. What kind of environment are we wanting to create, and where are our skills falling short? At that point, we then look at our internal training. We look at the SETA discretionary funding, remembering each SETA will have different objectives. They will have different things that they need to achieve in terms of skill shortage and scarce skills. So it is important that you look at what the SETA is focusing on. In addition, when you do your annual skills report, they ask a number of questions in terms of scarce skills as well as critical skills. Now, a lot of people just answer that just off the cuff because they just want to get to completing their skills development report because they believe that it is a legal requirement to do so. You are not doing skills development because it is a legal requirement to do so. You are doing skills development to try and obtain the most that you can get out of that skills. So if you're inputting accurate information, the SETA is then able to take that information and able to input that into sort of their strategic plan and to say most employers within our particular sector has said that XYZ is a scarce and critical skills. What they will then do is hopefully is they will then focus funding and in terms of particular things to try and upskill from that perspective. So they will look at particular learnerships that go into where there's a shortfall. So as an example, one of the things that we found is this whole element of AI and coming into the new age. A lot of SETAs are focusing on that type of thing as well as creating a workforce or people. So again, remember unemployed as well as employed learners. Where people are focusing on how do we move into this new age of technology. So not just AI, but what are we doing and how do we make it better? So the different things is obviously your internal training and your SETA discretionary funding. Remember here, your internal training, that is predominantly your 20% that you're claiming back as a thank you for submitting your WSP and your ATR. Thank you for giving us all the documentation. Your discretionary funding is where we want to be, where we want to try and take advantage and try and get the most money from the SETA, which we allocate in terms of our spend. We now have the people possibly working with us. Remember, you can have someone on a 12-month fixed-term contract or some of the learnerships are 18 months with no obligation for you to employ afterwards. Remembering, however, that within BEE, okay, there is an element there that if you have someone on a learnership and internship, just check your sector code. If you absorb the person after the learnership, you can get additional points. So you now have an ability to do that. So in terms of funding and learnerships and internships, my stance is I don't spend 18 months training people with the hope that they leave and go somewhere else because training people is hard, it's difficult, it's time consuming. So if I'm going to invest in this, I invest in this with the hope that that the person will stay. So if I have 5 people on a learnership or internship, I now have a pool of suitably qualified people, well, let's say suitably qualified. I have a pool of people that I can choose from to create a base in terms of my employment equity, where I go, I have these people, they've worked with me for 18 months, they now know the culture. Although they are not senior management or whatever, I'm now able to create a base of people that I can choose from to hopefully take that person and upskill them as we go forward. Okay. These learnerships and internships carry a little bit more weight in terms of your scorecard, as I showed you earlier. If we look over here, learnerships, if you didn't have learnerships, these points over here would then obviously not be there. And so you would have, if my maths is correct, it would be 25 points that you had to play with. Now that you have a learnership, and remember, a learnership, you don't necessarily have to place them with you. It could be an unemployed learner who is placed somewhere and you never ever see them. So there's various different options. Okay. Then we have our YES initiative, which is the Youth Employment Service, which is specifically for young people. So there is an age limit to somebody who would go onto YES. Now, there's various different things that you can do with YES, but the purpose of the YES initiative is to allow people to gain work experience. So it is generally for unemployed people who possibly have a qualification and they cannot get work experience. And so if you work within the YES initiative, you pay a certain amount of money in this whole process. But the YES initiative is to create an additional opportunity for you as the business to get additional points. Remember, as I said before, don't mix up learnerships and YES initiative and internships, because this is an added benefit that you can then take on for somebody who you're not necessarily putting on a learnership or internship, but that would come work with you for the purpose of getting experience. Whilst they are getting experience, you would give them, for argument's sake, a 12-month contract. During that time, you would give them workplace experience, which is generally internal experience. You could send them on various, trainings, etc. And anything that you do for training for that person during the time would then obviously count towards your BEE points. Alrighty, then there is your IT180 Tax Incentives. So as I spoke about it before, as certain learnerships, when you go for those learnerships, you have the ability to submit annually an IT180 to help reduce your tax. Okay, so that in essence, although you don't get the money in your pocket, you're reducing your tax, which in essence, like I explained earlier, for that one particular learnership, you were paying, I think it was 33,000 Rand, with the ability of claiming up to 22,500 Rand. So if you take advantage of that, you can then also do your RT180s and hopefully reduce your tax liability after the fact. Okay, I don't see any questions. Okay, so I'm going to hopefully, I've kind of explained that as best as I can. But these are the various different things. So skills for me actually sits as sort of a cornerstone in terms of getting, the most for your BEE points. And then obviously we now move on to employment equity, which has become, remembering that employment equity is a legislative requirement. So if you have more than 50 employees, you are required to comply with employment equity. And now with our sector code, is we have our 5-year plan, which says that we need to meet a minimum of XYZ in particular levels. So my stance is that, in terms of in 5 years' time, we don't know what will happen if we don't meet our sector targets. I do understand that there's various elements in which we say, they can issue fines, etc. We don't know what will happen. But if you're going to be doing, your BEE as well as your skills development, I would highly recommend that what you do is you try and pull in from a strategic perspective, how do you now meet your employment equity objectives? So, in terms of, as I've mentioned before, so in terms of South Africa and recruiting as well as retaining staff, one of the biggest things that we have in South Africa is a skill shortage. Okay. We also have the element of poaching, specifically in highly qualified Black candidates. So you have people that come within your business, they're really, really good, and then they're poached by a competitor, and you just don't have the ability to, match whatever it is. We also have high turnover. So the turnover now is very different to what it was, 20 years ago. People don't stay for very long, and they leave for better opportunities. Now, remembering that those better opportunities are not necessarily, financial. They are financial, but this is just one of the aspects. Other things that we can look to do within the business and trying to keep and retain our staff to ensure that we hopefully get to the end of 5 years having made some progress, is starting to look at how do we use our skills to try and impact and meet our objective. Historically, it was always about finding a particular person or persons that we wanted to upskill. So there's only one or two, unless you're in a big corporate in which you have succession planning and you have multiple people that go through programs. That's not always an option. But if you start to identify groups of people now with a plan of action where you say, if we have a pool of available candidates that we bring on at lower levels, with the view of saying, obviously, we know that there's turnover, but we have an ability, for argument's sake, to say, if we take 5 people, understanding that those 5 people, we may put on internships, learnerships, we're going to utilize our funding through the SETA to get our points, and in the hopes that those 5 people, in, 5 years' time, what we actually need is we need 2. So we're going to hope that 2 of those 5 people will stay. Yes, we're expending, all of the time and energy upskilling those people, but all that time and energy, as well as possibly money that you're getting from the SETA, is going towards your BEE points anyway. And so that's time and expense you're now using to ensure that you're getting your 31 points or whatever it is for your SETA, and you're able to, through the tracking and having a look at it, you're able to take advantage of everything, with the hopes of then getting to the point that you, in 5 years' time, don't just have a group of semi-skilled and unskilled that are now equally, or at least, representative. You have the ability, and it does take time, where you're employing people at the lower levels, and what you are doing is you're actively training them every year to move from one level to the other. And so now you have the ability, again, not to say that people aren't going to leave, but you have the ability to upskill and to move those people into positions of management. And when I say, so is you now identifying people specifically from a BEE perspective, but that's not to say that other people would be excluded. You just don't get the points. Okay. So from a equity perspective, I would use my skills to actively look at how we can possibly upskill and create an environment internally where people are learning and developing. Okay. So one is, when we look at linking employment equity to skills development, is what we're going to do is we develop the skills pipeline. So it's really important that you start to have a look from the base as you look at what are we going to do. Obviously, training changes, but once you set up an internal sort of training structure, you can use that same structure going forward. You align your workforce planning, with your sector target. So look at where you want to be in 5 years' time. Obviously, when we look at where we want to be in 5 years' time, it's quite important that what you start to do is because you've got to assume a number. So my suggestion is, when you're looking at your 5-year plan, is you start to look at where have we been in the past 3 to 5 years, what has been our turnover as well as our retention ratio, to try and see where do we expect that we're going to be in 5 years' time. And then you take that and you align it and say, okay, who do we have where? I understand that we're making assumptions, but who do we have where? What skills are we lacking from our skills audit? And what we start to do is to say, all things being equal, if we had everything, what is the trajectory for this group of people to move forward into the levels within the next 5 years? And then slowly what you do is you create a culture of learning and a culture in which people want to stay because they have the ability to learn and grow and develop. And I understand, it sounds like we're talking about extremely corporate. It sounds like we're talking about environments in which you're talking about white-collar workers. It doesn't have to be that, because we have various different sectors within South Africa that focus on manufacturing. There's chemicals. There's a number of different places in which you can upskill people within your workplace aligned to your industry, which is why it is really important that you're on the right SETA. Because if you're not on the right SETA, you're going to be offered training that doesn't necessarily align to your particular sector. Okay. All right, then moving on to the last slide is obviously this is, the high level sort of nice things that HR people say. But in terms of my experience in working with this is that what it does is it creates an environment in which you become an employer of choice. You become an employer that invests in your staff. And you're ensuring that going forward that your staff are not being left behind, that they have the skills, the ability, your workforce is sustainable, you're using the funding that is available to you through the SETA and various other different aspects. The BE obviously makes you, somebody that has the ability to work with bigger clients within South Africa. So you're getting your points from that perspective. But you're changing the culture of your business just by putting some things in place that will allow you to actively take advantage of the various things. Okay, so all of those things said and done. Okay, that brings us to the end of the session. I've spoken very high level. I think we've got a question somewhere. I have spoken very high level about how you can take advantage of these things, but if some key takeaways from this particular session is that if you are wanting to invest in this, if you are wanting to invest to try and find out how you do best in terms of your skills development, I would highly recommend that you don't start on the 25th of April quickly trying to put together your workplace skills plan. People do it because they think they have to do it, and it's a box ticking exercise. I would recommend that what you do is you start now. Okay, so you start now trying to identify what it is that you're going to do, where your shortfalls are, link it in with your BEE to understand what is it that we're even looking for. Because if you don't link it in with your BEE, you have no idea how much money you're supposed to spend. So how much do we spend on internal? Who are we going to focus on? What are we looking for? Currently, the way that a lot of people do it is they submit their skills in the hopes that they get there. The same as BE is that we get to the end of the year realizing we haven't done enough. All of these things almost need to be managed monthly. And if internally your departments don't understand how the three link together, you have three individual people or possibly the finance person, because very often BE is lumped on them. They're just recording the information, but nobody is talking. So you haven't got your HR person and your training person, if you're lucky enough to have one, who are talking together to understand how do we link these three things together. Okay. So that brings us to, I got a thing from Kerry here. We've recently reached the 500K per year salary cost. We're not registered with SETA. Okay. So you would automatically sort of be registered with the SETA. So if you've reached the 500,000 per year salary mark, you will automatically be paying your 1% to SARS. Okay. SARS will then have allocated you to a SETA, and SARS then pays that 1% across to the SETA. Okay, you don't have to do this. So the SETA will then take that money, any money that is not used by you to claim back your 20%, they then use that funding to fund things like discretionary grants, learnerships. They have to use that money. So if you choose not to claim it back, it gets given and redistributed to other people or organizations to do things like your discretionary funding, etc. So you don't, like I say, skills is something that you don't have to do, but if you're going to do it and want to spend, especially if your salary bill is high, then taking part in skills and that kind of thing is where you want to be. Okay. If you need help, if you need monthly help with this, we're more than happy to have a conversation. We do work with other organizations where we take on this role, where we do monthly. Like I say, we're not BE specialists. Our job is to try and make sure that the three are linked and that we're speaking to the right stakeholders within the business to make sure that these are linked so that you're getting the most out of it we liaise with your SETA to make sure that your discretionary funding is coming through and all the documents that you need are being submitted. So if FBE is important to you and you're not just doing it to get your level 4, if it's something that you're actively trying to do and you're struggling to spend your 3% or whatever it is, you can then utilize your skills to impact your EE as well as to impact your employment equity. Okay, so I have said a lot of words. I'm not sure if anyone has any particular questions or anything like that. Does anybody want to post anything in the chat? That brings us to the end of the session today. But as I said before, please feel free, if you have any questions, you're more than welcome to email us. If you would like to have a consultation, please reach out. Don't leave your skills development to the last minute. Start working on it now so that you can try and get the best out. And don't forget to look at your discretionary funding because that's obviously where you will get a lot of your money as well. Okay. Thank you, everybody. I'll stay on for a few minutes. If anybody has any questions, I'll hang around here for a little bit. Okay.
Hi, Nikki, you do have a question.
Yes, yeah, I got it. Thanks. So ETQA is the Education Training Quality Assurance, and it is the bodies that are responsible for monitoring and auditing education and training in South Africa. So that is specifically that we look at things in terms of South African qualifications or SAQA. So the ETQA is to ensure that when you've got an organization that provides any kind of qualification, gives you an NQF level, is that whoever is providing you with that qualification has been accredited with ETQA. So that is what it is. Okay. So it is required to ensure, obviously, some sort of quality assurance. Okay. Alrighty, everybody. So I'm going to jump off the meeting. Please feel free to reach out to us if you would like any help in this space. We will see you at the next webinar. Thanks, everybody. Bye.